Your phone knows everything about you. Not in the dramatic thriller movie way where shadowy corporations track your every movement and sell your data to the highest bidder. In the quieter, more intimate, completely ordinary way that accumulates over years of living a real life on a small glowing screen. Your messages. Not just the casual ones, the ones that say "on my way" and "what do you want for dinner?" The other ones. The 2 a.m. messages you sent when you were scared about something and needed to tell someone. The long threads with your best friend that go to places you'd never go out loud, in front of anyone. The conversations with your doctor that you typed with a kind of careful, private precision of someone who needs the answer but doesn't need an audience for the asking. The things you told your husband that you haven't told his mother. The things you haven't told anyone yet, because the words are still new and fragile, because you're still figuring out the shape of them, because you need to hold them privately for a little while longer before they belong to anyone else. Your phone holds all of that. And you trust it. Not naively, you trust it the way you trust a locked door. Because it requires your passcode. Because it lives in your pocket or on your nightstand. Because it is yours, and the boundary around it is one of the clearest, most universally understood boundaries that exists in modern life. Nobody touches your phone without your permission. Unless they wait until you're asleep. Unless they already know your passcode. From a moment weeks earlier when you were showing them a photo and your hands were full and you said, without thinking twice, the code is 2847. And they stored that number somewhere in the back of their mind, not for an emergency, but for an opportunity. Our storyteller, we'll call her Sara, woke up on a Sunday morning completely unaware that the night before, while she slept beside her husband in their own bedroom, someone had been in their apartment, in the quiet, in the dark, and had picked up her phone from the nightstand. Had typed in that code. Had opened her messages. Had scrolled and read, and continued reading, through 3 months of her most private conversations. Had found something she was not supposed to find. And had closed the phone, placed it back exactly where it had been, and gone back to bed as though nothing had happened. Sara didn't find out for 3 days. And when she did, the story she posted on Reddit became one of the most shared, most saved, most passionately commented posts of the entire year. Not because of what was in the phone, but because of what Sara did next. And because of the one detail, revealed in her update, 3 weeks later, that made 500,000 people stop scrolling and start typing. Stay with me. This one is going to stay with you. Welcome back, or if this is your first time here, I am genuinely glad this video found you today. Because what we do on this channel every single week is take the stories that real people are living, the ones that are too complicated, too painful, too outrageous for polite conversation, and we sit with them together. Carefully. Without rushing toward a verdict before we've understood the full picture. Today's story is about privacy. About boundaries. About the specific, deeply personal violation of having someone enter your inner life without your knowledge or consent, and then use what they found there as ammunition in their own agenda. But it is also, and this is the part one want you to stay for, a story about what it looks like when a marriage holds. When a husband is tested in a real and significant way, and rises to meet it. When a woman who has been violated chooses, with extraordinary care and precision, exactly how she wants to respond. And when an apology, a real one, not the kind that's actually about the person giving it, arrives unexpectedly and changes everything. I want to make you one promise before we begin. This story has a full, complete, deeply satisfying ending. Not a revenge fantasy, something better than that. Something true. I want you there for all of it. Please don't leave early. Let's start at the beginning. With Sara and her husband David. And with the woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that loving someone and understanding their boundaries were two entirely separate categories that didn't need to overlap. Sara was 34 years old when this story begins. She had been with her husband David for 5 years, married for 3, and their life together was, by any honest account, a genuinely good one. Not perfect. Not frictionless. But the kind of life that two people build when they actually like each other and have the patience to work out the difficult parts without dismantling the whole structure every time something doesn't fit. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-sized city. They had a gray cat named Miso who had very strong opinions about where he was allowed to sit and extended those opinions to include David's keyboard, Sara's work papers, and any horizontal surface that had recently been cleaned. They cooked dinner together most nights, competently, not beautifully, and had a standing disagreement about whether pasta water needed to be as salty as seawater that had been going on for 2 years without resolution. It was, in the best sense of the word, an ordinary life. The kind built from accumulated small choices made by two people who had decided to keep choosing each other. Sara was, and she said this about herself plainly without apology, a private person. She was careful to distinguish this from being secretive, because there is an important difference. A secretive person hides things. A private person simply understands that not every thought needs to be broadcast, that some conversations are meant only for the people in them, that a person's inner life is their own to tend and to share on their own timeline at their own discretion. Sara believed this about herself and about everyone else. It was, for her, not a quirk but a foundational value. This had been, from almost the beginning of her relationship with David, a recurring source of friction with his mother. Margaret was 64 years old. She had been widowed 4 years prior, when David's father had died suddenly of a cardiac event that had taken the family completely by surprise and had rearranged Margaret's entire world in the space of a single afternoon. She had loved her husband deeply. She had built her life around their marriage and her son, and when one of those anchors was gone, the weight she transferred to the remaining one, David, was significant. Margaret was not a villain. She was not deliberately cruel. She was something more difficult to navigate than a villain. She was a woman operating from genuine love who had never been required to examine the assumptions that love was built on. She believed that family meant closeness, and closeness meant access, and access meant the right to know everything essentially that was knowable. She had grown up in a family that operated this way, had married into one that operated this way, and had raised her son in an environment where privacy was not a concept that needed defending because nobody particularly needed it. And then David had married Sara. Sara, who locked her phone. Sara, who had friends Margaret had never met and conversations Margaret had never been told about. Sara, who declined to share details about her work, her health, her inner life, not out of hostility but out of the simple conviction that those things were hers and she would share them when she chose to. Sara, who smiled warmly at Margaret's questions and answered them at the level of detail she was comfortable with, which was never quite the level of detail Margaret wanted. Margaret had interpreted this, consistently and sincerely, as coldness. As Sara keeping David from her. As evidence of something wrong in the marriage that nobody was telling her about. She had been wrong about all of it. But she had held her interpretation with the tenacity of someone who had confused certainty with truth for so long that they no longer noticed the difference. Sara had managed this dynamic with what her friends called, with admiration and mild exhaustion on her behalf, the patience of someone who has decided to play a 20-year chess game against an opponent who doesn't know they're playing chess. She set small, clear limits. She enforced them consistently. She communicated concerns to David calmly and specifically rather than emotionally and broadly. She had been, by every measure, doing this correctly. And then Margaret came for a birthday visit. 3 days. 2 nights. The weekend that changed everything. The birthday visit had been planned 6 weeks in advance. Sara had been the one to plan it, which was not incidental but intentional, because she had learned that having control over the schedule was the most effective tool she had for managing Margaret visits without anyone needing to name the management out loud. She had booked the restaurant, a good one, celebratory but not intimate, the kind of place with enough ambient noise that silences didn't become uncomfortable. She had planned a Saturday afternoon at a botanical garden that Margaret had mentioned wanting to visit. She had stocked the guest room with Margaret's preferred brand of herbal tea. She had, in short, built a weekend that was designed to make Margaret feel genuinely welcomed and cared for while maintaining enough structure that spontaneous boundary crossing had limited opportunity to occur. Friday evening, Margaret arrived. David picked her up from the train station. Sara had dinner ready, a recipe Margaret had once praised, deliberately chosen. The evening was pleasant. Margaret was in good spirits. She complimented the apartment, asked about David's work, asked about Sara's work with slightly less warmth but more than usual. Sara went to bed feeling cautiously that this visit might be one of the better ones. Saturday, the botanical garden. A long, genuinely lovely afternoon. Margaret knew the names of plants in a way that Sara found unexpectedly charming. They walked for 2 hours. Margaret held David's arm. At one point she held Sara's briefly, while navigating an uneven path, a small physical gesture that Sara filed away as significant without fully knowing why. Dinner was good. The restaurant was exactly what Sara had intended it to be. Margaret had 2 glasses of wine and told a story about David at age 7 that made all 3 of them laugh. They came home. Margaret went to the guest room. David and Sara brushed their teeth in the comfortable silence of people who have done this beside each other enough times that it requires no conversation. Sara put her phone on the nightstand, the left nightstand, her side, where it had lived every night for 3 years. She set an alarm. She lay down. She was asleep within 10 minutes. The weekend had been pleasant but tiring in the specific way that the performance of normalcy always is, even when the performance goes well. She did not know that at some point in the hours that followed, she estimates, from the evidence she later gathered, somewhere between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., the guest room door had opened. That footsteps had moved down the hallway. That someone had entered the bedroom where she and David slept. She did not know that her phone, the phone with the lock screen and the passcode she had mentioned, once weeks ago, while showing Margaret a photo of Miso, had been lifted from the nightstand. Quietly. Carefully. With the practiced deliberateness of someone who had thought about this moment before it happened. She did not know that for however long it took, and based on what Margaret later admitted to having read, it was not a brief glance, someone had been in her messages. In her conversations. In the private, encrypted, password-protected record of her inner life that she had every reason to believe was safe. She did not know that when the phone was placed back on the nightstand and the footsteps returned down the hallway and the guest room door closed again, something had been taken from her that she had not consented to give. She woke up on Sunday morning to sunlight and the smell of coffee. Margaret had gotten up early and made it, as she often did on visits, the hospitality of it landing differently in retrospect, and she felt fine. Rested. The weekend had gone well. Margaret left after brunch with hugs and a promise to call in the week. Everything looked normal. Everything was not normal. Sara would not know this for 3 more days. The thing that disturbs me most, looking back, is how normal Sunday morning felt. How I made coffee and sat across from her and talked about nothing important and felt like the visit had actually gone well. She sat there knowing what she had done. I sat there not knowing. And she poured me coffee and smiled at me like we had just had a perfectly ordinary weekend. Wednesday afternoon. Sara was at her desk, finishing a work report, when her phone rang. Her closest friend Jen, whose name in Sara's contacts was accompanied by a small purple heart that had been there for 9 years and had survived 4 phone upgrades. They talked the way old friends do, easily, about several things at once, with a conversational shorthand of people who have known each other long enough that full sentences are often optional. Work. A film they'd both seen. The Botanical Garden, which Sara mentioned in passing, because it had genuinely been a good part of the weekend. And then Jen said something that stopped Sara mid-sentence. Jen said, "I just want you to know, whatever happens, whatever she says, you don't have to explain the therapy to anyone. Especially not to her." Sara's hand went still on her desk. The sentence had arrived casually, in the tone of reassurance, as though it was a follow-up to a conversation they'd already had. As though Jen expected Sara to know what she was referring to. Sara did not know what she was referring to. Because Sara had not told Jen anything recently about therapy. She had told Jen about therapy months ago, in a private text message, a long and careful one, sent on a Tuesday evening when Sara had finally made the appointment she'd been thinking about making for a year and needed to tell someone she trusted. That conversation lived on Sara's phone. In her messages. Nowhere else. Sara asked very carefully, her voice completely level in the way that voices get when a person is holding something very large very still inside them, "Jen. What are you talking about? Who said something to you?" Jen went quiet. Then she said, "Margaret called me." The room changed. That is the only way Sara described it in her Reddit post. The room changed, the quality of the air, the way the light looked, the specific texture of the Wednesday afternoon she had been sitting in a moment ago, which now felt like a completely different kind of afternoon entirely. Margaret had called Jen. Not a family member. Not a mutual friend. Jen, whose number lived in Sara's contacts, whose name Margaret would have had no way of knowing unless she had seen it in Sara's messages. Margaret had called Jen to talk about Sara. To talk about things she had read in Sara's phone. Sara asked Jen to tell her everything. All of it. What Margaret had said, how the conversation had started, exactly what information she had referenced. Jen told her, carefully, fully, with the contained outrage of someone who had been sitting on this for 2 days and had been deeply uncertain what to do with it. When Jen finished, Sara sat for a moment. Then she said, "Can I call you back in an hour? I need to check something." She went to her phone settings. She checked the access logs, a feature she had enabled months ago and never had occasion to examine. The data was there. A login on Saturday night. 1:47 a.m. Her phone. Her account. Not her. She confirmed the passcode issue. She had mentioned it exactly once, in passing, on a visit 6 weeks prior. She had not thought about it since. She thought about it now. She called the phone carrier. Confirmed the access timestamp. Documented everything, methodically, in a notes file she labeled with the date and the words for reference. In the same way she documented everything important at work, because Sara was someone who understood that feelings were real but evidence was useful. It took her 45 minutes to build the full picture. When it was built, she looked at it for a long time. Then she texted David, "I need to talk to you tonight. It's important. Not urgent, everyone is fine. But important." David texted back within 2 minutes, "I'll be home by 6. He was home by 5:40. Sara did not tell David in a rush. She had learned, over years of navigating difficult conversations with people she loved, that the pace at which you deliver hard information shapes how it is received. She sat him down. She put her phone on the table between them. And she walked him through everything, not emotionally, not with the shaking voice of someone who has been holding this for hours and needs it to be over, but calmly. Factually. With the organized clarity of someone who has decided that this conversation is too important to be muddied by the presentation. The access log. The timestamp. The passcode. Jen's call. What Margaret had said to Jen. What information she had referenced. Specific, private information that existed only in Sara's messages and nowhere else. The documentation Sara had built over the past hour and a half. She presented it in order. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for a reaction until she had finished presenting the evidence. David listened to all of it without interrupting. This, Sara noted, was not nothing. It would have been easy and human, and perhaps even understandable, to interrupt with defenses or questions or the instinctive protective responses of a person who loves both the accused and the accuser. He did not do that. He listened until Sara was finished. She called the phone carrier. Confirmed the access timestamp. Documented everything, methodically, in a notes file she labeled with the date and the words for reference. In the same way she documented everything important at work, because Sara was someone who understood that feelings were real but evidence was useful. It took her 45 minutes to build the full picture. When it was built, she looked at it for a long time. Then she texted David, "I need to talk to you tonight. It's important. Not urgent, everyone is fine. But important." David texted back within 2 minutes, "I'll be home by 6. He was home by 5:40. Sara did not tell David in a rush. She had learned, over years of navigating difficult conversations with people she loved, that the pace at which you deliver hard information shapes how it is received. She sat him down. She put her phone on the table between them. And she walked him through everything, not emotionally, not with the shaking voice of someone who has been holding this for hours and needs it to be over, but calmly. Factually. With the organized clarity of someone who has decided that this conversation is too important to be muddied by the presentation. The access log. The timestamp. The passcode. Jen's call. What Margaret had said to Jen. What information she had referenced. Specific, private information that existed only in Sara's messages and nowhere else. The documentation Sara had built over the past hour and a half. She presented it in order. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for a reaction until she had finished presenting the evidence. David listened to all of it without interrupting. This, Sara noted, was not nothing. It would have been easy and human, and perhaps even understandable, to interrupt with defenses or questions or the instinctive protective responses of a person who loves both the accused and the accuser. He did not do that. He listened until Sara was finished. Then he sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "Show me the access log." She showed him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "I need to call her. Tonight. And I need you to be there." Sara said yes. The call happened at 7:15 p.m. David dialed. Speaker on. Both of them at the kitchen table, the same table where, 3 days earlier, Margaret had poured Sara coffee and smiled. Margaret picked up on the third ring. She said hello warmly. David said, "Mom. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly. Did you access Sara's phone during your visit last weekend?" A pause. 4 seconds. 5. Then Margaret said, "I was worried about you." Not a denial. Not a question. Not what are you talking about. A justification. Which is a different thing entirely, and both David and Sara heard that difference in the same instant. Margaret said she had seen things. She didn't say what, yet, that concerned her. She said she had only been trying to understand what was happening in her son's marriage. She said Sara had always been closed off and she had never known how to reach her, and she had thought, if she could just understand a little more. David said, "Mom. Stop." She stopped. He said, "What you just described is not concern. It is not care. It is going into Sara's private phone while she was asleep, without her consent, reading her personal messages, and then calling her friend to discuss what you found. I need you to understand what that is. It is a violation. It is a betrayal of the trust that allows you to be in our home. And it is the kind of thing that has consequences." Another pause. Then Sara spoke. 5 sentences. Quiet. Precise. The sentences that would later be quoted in 47,000 comments. "Margaret. What you did constitutes unauthorized access to a private device. I have documented the evidence, timestamps, access logs, and a recorded account of your conversation with my friend. I am not going to the police today. That decision remains mine. But I need you to understand, without any room for misinterpretation, that this is not something I am going to absorb quietly. What happens next depends entirely on what you choose to do in the next 48 hours. I'll let David continue now." She stood up from the table. She walked to the balcony. She closed the door behind her and stood in the night air, the city noise below her, the lit windows of other apartments across the way, other people living their Wednesday evenings in their own private worlds, and she breathed. Inside, she could hear David's voice, low and steady, continuing the conversation. She did not need to hear the words. She had said what she needed to say. The rest belonged to him now, and she trusted him with it. That trust, she said later, was the thing she was most grateful for. Not the outcome. Not the apology that came later. The simple, foundational fact that she could stand on a balcony in the dark and trust that the person inside was handling things the way she needed them to be handled. That she was not alone in her own marriage. She had expected to feel rage on that balcony. What she felt instead was something quieter. The specific, hard-won calm of a woman who knew exactly who she was. Stay with me. Because what Margaret did in those 48 hours, and what her apology actually looked like, and the one detail Sara revealed in her update 3 weeks later that caused the comment section to go completely silent before erupting, we are almost there. And I promise you, it is worth every minute of this story to get to it. Margaret called back 18 hours later. Not David, Sara. She called Sara's phone. Sara let it ring through the first time. She listened to the voicemail in full before deciding what to do with it. The voicemail was 4 minutes and 22 seconds long. Sara timed it. It moved through several distinct phases, the phases that Sara recognized, from years of therapy and from reading about family systems, as the standard architecture of an unaccountable apology. First, reframing. She had only done it because she was worried. She had heard things, she did not specify what things or from whom, that had made her concerned about David. Her intentions had been good. Second, minimization. She had only looked at a few messages. She hadn't meant to read so much. She hadn't realized how it would come across. Third, redirection. Sara had always made her feel like an outsider. She had never felt truly welcomed. She had only been trying to understand a family she felt excluded from. Fourth, self-pity. She was David's mother. She had given her whole life to him. She didn't understand why this was being treated like such a serious thing when she had only been acting out of love. Fifth, the apology that was not an apology. She was sorry if Sara felt her privacy had been invaded. She was sorry if the conversation with Jen had been upsetting. She was sorry things had gotten to this point. Sara listened to all 4 minutes and 22 seconds. She sent the voicemail to David with a single message. This is what accountability sounds like when it's really about the person who got caught, not the person who was hurt. I thought you should hear it. David called his mother that evening. Sara was not in the room for this conversation, by her own choice. She felt that David needed the space to have it without an audience, and that she needed the space to not be present for whatever Margaret said. She sat in their bedroom with miso on her lap and waited. David came in 40 minutes later. He sat on the edge of the bed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told Sara what he had said. He had told Margaret that the voicemail was not an apology, that he had heard her pain and fear in it, and he understood where those came from, and that none of that changed what was required. He had told her that Sara deserved a real apology, not a voicemail, not a phone call in person without conditions, without the voicemail's defensive architecture. He had told her that until that happened, visits were paused, not permanently, not as punishment, but because trust needed to be earned back and that process had to start somewhere. He had told her he loved her. He had told her none of this changed that. And he had told her that if she needed time to understand why this was serious, he would give her that time, but he could not give her his wife's privacy in exchange for keeping the peace. Sara looked at her husband for a long moment when he finished. Then she leaned over and put her head on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Sometimes that is the whole conversation. Margaret arrived 3 days later. She had called ahead, which was itself notable. She came at the time they had agreed on. She sat across from Sara at the kitchen table, the same chairs, the same window light. David sat beside Sara. Margaret folded her hands. She did not have a cake. She did not have a rehearsed opening. She looked at Sara and she said. David came in 40 minutes later. He sat on the edge of the bed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told Sara what he had said. He had told Margaret that the voicemail was not an apology, that he had heard her pain and fear in it, and he understood where those came from, and that none of that changed what was required. He had told her that Sara deserved a real apology, not a voicemail, not a phone call in person without conditions, without the voicemail's defensive architecture. He had told her that until that happened, visits were paused, not permanently, not as punishment, but because trust needed to be earned back and that process had to start somewhere. He had told her he loved her. He had told her none of this changed that. And he had told her that if she needed time to understand why this was serious, he would give her that time, but he could not give her his wife's privacy in exchange for keeping the peace. Sara looked at her husband for a long moment when he finished. Then she leaned over and put her head on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Sometimes that is the whole conversation. Margaret arrived 3 days later. She had called ahead, which was itself notable. She came at the time they had agreed on. She sat across from Sara at the kitchen table, the same chairs, the same window light. David sat beside Sara. Margaret folded her hands. She did not have a cake. She did not have a rehearsed opening. She looked at Sara and she said, "What I did was wrong. Not misguided. Not an overreach born of concern. Wrong. I entered your private phone without your knowledge or consent. I read messages I had no right to read. I used what I found to call your friend, not mine, and have a conversation about you that you didn't know was happening. I took information that you had kept private, for your own reasons, and I made it material for my own agenda. I am sorry. Not because I was caught. Not because there are consequences. Because what I did was a betrayal of the trust that you extended to me by allowing me into your home and your life, and you didn't deserve it." Sara had been prepared, walking into that conversation, for many things. A version of the voicemail with better packaging. Tears that redirected attention back to Margaret. A long explanation of good intentions. Another non-apology dressed up as a real one. She had not been prepared for that. She sat with it for a moment. Long enough for it to settle. Long enough to check, internally honestly, whether it was real or whether it was performance. She had learned, over years of navigating Margaret, to tell the difference. This, she decided, was real. She said, "Thank you. I'm going to need time before I know what this means for us going forward. But I heard you." Margaret nodded. She did not push for more. She did not ask for a timeline or a forgiveness she hadn't earned yet. She stood up, said goodbye to David, and left. The door closed. The apartment was quiet. Miso emerged from under the couch, apparently having assessed the energy of the room and found it acceptable, and sat in the center of the rug looking satisfied with himself. Sara exhaled. For the first time since Wednesday, completely. Sara posted her original Reddit thread the evening after the confrontation call, before the in-person apology, before the resolution. She posted it because she needed to process what had happened, and because she had been a reader of Reddit's family communities long enough to know that sometimes 1,000 strangers with no stake in your situation see things more clearly than the people inside it. The post got 58,000 upvotes in 24 hours. 3 weeks later, she posted the update. The full account, the voicemail, David's response, the in-person apology, where things stood. The update performed even better than the original. But it was the final paragraph, 3 sentences long, that traveled furthest. Because at the end of the update, Sara revealed what had been in those messages. What Margaret had found when she had scrolled through 3 months of Sara's private conversations on a Saturday night while Sara slept. Margaret had found Sara's therapy messages. Not a crisis. Not evidence of a troubled marriage. Not the secret Margaret had apparently been convinced existed. Sara had been in the early stages of working with a therapist, her own personal therapist, for her own personal work, completely separate from the marriage, because Sara understood that taking care of her mental health was part of taking care of herself and her relationship. She had not told David's family because it was none of their business. She had not told most people because she was still figuring out the shape of it and she needed it to be private while she did. Margaret had read those messages. Had read about Sara's sessions, her reflections, the things she was working through. Had then called Jen, Sara's trusted friend, to discuss what she had found, as though the information belonged to anyone other than Sara. When this detail emerged in the update, the comment section went very quiet for approximately 30 seconds and then erupted with a response that Sara described as the most validated I have ever felt by strangers on the internet. Because there is a particular, specific, deeply personal violation in someone reading your therapy messages. In someone taking the most carefully protected, most genuinely private work you are doing on yourself, work that requires vulnerability and trust and the specific safety of knowing it is not being watched, and using it as intelligence in their own emotional agenda. It crossed a line that even the general snooping had not quite reached. And the internet, collectively, felt that. I want to say one thing about the therapy detail, because I've seen some comments asking whether I'm going to tell Margaret what she read. I'm not. Not because I'm ashamed of it, I'm not. But because the information is mine. I get to decide who knows it, and when, and in what context. That Margaret already knows it, against my will, does not obligate me to make it a conversational topic between us. My healing process is not material for our relationship. It is mine. Full stop. I want to say something to anyone who is wondering whether they were right to be angry about something similar, whether their violation was serious enough to justify the response. Here is what I know now that I wish I had known earlier. There is no threshold of violation you have to meet before your boundaries deserve respect. A small snooping and a large one are both snooping. The size of the betrayal does not determine whether you were entitled to be hurt by it. You were. You are. As for Margaret and me, we are at the very beginning of something. I do not know what that something is yet. I am not optimistic in the way of someone who has forgotten what happened. I am cautiously, carefully open in the way of someone who saw a real apology and chose to acknowledge it without pretending that acknowledgement is the same as trust restored. Trust is rebuilt in small increments over long time. We are at day 1. I have David beside me. I have Miso on my feet. I have my own inner life intact, which is the most important thing. I'll keep you posted. I want to sit with something Sara said in her update, one sentence, because I think it is the most important thing in this entire story, and it is not about Margaret at all. There is no threshold of violation you have to meet before your boundaries deserve respect. This traveled because it named something that most people who have experienced boundary violations know intuitively, but have never heard stated this plainly. The minimization, it was just a peek, she meant well, is it really that big a deal, works because it implies there is a scale. That violations exist on a spectrum, and only the serious ones at the far end of the spectrum are the ones that count. What Sara said is that the scale is irrelevant. The boundary was legitimate from the moment it existed. The violation, however small or large, is the violation. You do not have to wait until something becomes catastrophic before you are allowed to name it as a problem. And what David did in this story is equally worth naming, because it would be easy to make this a story about Margaret, or a story about Sara's strength, and miss what David contributed. He did not choose between his mother and his wife. He held both of them to the same standard of honesty. He did not use his mother's pain as a reason to ask Sara to absorb something she had every right not to absorb. He stood in a genuinely difficult position, the only child of a widowed mother who had made him her primary emotional anchor, asked to confront that mother about a serious violation, and he was simply, completely, unmovably clear. That is not easy. Most people in that position find reasons, good-sounding reasons, to soften it. To make it a little smaller than it was. To ask the person who was hurt to do a little more of the carrying. David did not do that. And Sara knew it. And the 500,000 people who read her post responded to it, in no small part, because of him. Privacy is not the absence of love. It is not distance or coldness or the sign of something wrong. It is the recognition that a person's inner life is their own, that there are things that belong only to the person who is living them, until they choose to share them. What Margaret violated was not just a phone. It was Sara's right to herself. And that is not a small thing. That is not something that requires a threshold to defend. Sara said at the very end of her update, "I have my own inner life intact." That is the most important thing. I have been thinking about that sentence since I first read it. Your inner life is yours. It always was. And anyone who tries to tell you that love gives them access to it, without your invitation, without your consent, is confusing two things that have nothing to do with each other. Love is not access. Love is respect. And respect is what Margaret is, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to learn. Your inner life is yours. Love does not grant access to it. Respect does. Megaphone call to action. 30:00, 31:00 warm, direct, real. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. For staying. For giving this story the space it deserved. Has anyone ever gone through your phone, or your things, without asking? What did you do when you found out? Or, what do you wish you had done? Drop it in the comments. You don't have to share everything, just what you're comfortable with. The people in this community are among the most thoughtful on this platform, and they read each other. Your story is safe here. If this video felt like something you needed today, if Sara's words landed somewhere true for you, subscribe. Hit the bell. Share it with one person who needs to hear that their boundaries are legitimate, regardless of who crossed them or how large or small the crossing was. I'll see you next week. Take care of your inner life. It belongs entirely to you.